For those of you just joining us, we'll get started here in a minute or two. I'll wait for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks again for all of you who are joining us. We'll get started in just another minute. Okay, thank you and welcome today to Oceans of Solutions, covering blue climate and ocean-based climate strategies. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars organized and hosted by the Society of Environmental Journalists and Columbia University, with support from the Hewlett Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Packard Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation. We are very excited to be focusing on covering solutions and providing not only some story ideas, but also some strategies for how you cover climate solutions in a number of different areas. Today, we're going to focus on oceans, and please mark your calendars for future webinars on methane and energy, biodiversity, and business and ESG. Now, however, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Justin Warland, who is the senior correspondent for Time Magazine. And he is going to introduce you to the panelists and lead a lively conversation today. Thank you. Justin?
Well, thank you, Megan, for the introduction and the invitation and for organizing this very timely panel. I'm Justin Warland. I'm a senior correspondent at Time, where I write about climate change. And I'm thrilled to be here. Climate, or rather oceans, play a critical role in climate, as I'm sure you all know. And yet they often are under-recognized, under-reported. And so it's my hope that this panel will give everyone some background to help report more on this topic and really dig in, as well as getting people up to date on some of the latest discussions around oceans. Just very briefly, for your background, the way this session will work is I'm going to begin with questions to the panelists for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to audience questions. You can ask those questions in the Q&A box in the webinar, and you can start doing that right away. I'll remind you again, but feel free to drop them in as soon as you would like. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly. In lieu of opening statements, I'll then ask each of them one sort of background question to get the conversation going, and then we'll jump into a more dynamic discussion. So we have Dr. Sarah Cooley, who is the Director of Climate Science at the Ocean Conservancy. We have Justin Kinney, counselor at the Bureau of Oceans and counselor at the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the U.S. State Department. And Justin is standing in for Assistant Secretary of State Monica Medina, who had an urgent matter come up. We have Ambassador Peter Thompson, who is the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, and Ian Urbina, who's Director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. Thank you to everyone for participating. So this session comes just a few days really before the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon. And so I want to start with you, Ambassador Thompson, as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. You've described the Lisbon Conference as an opportunity to really dig into solutions. What sort of solutions do you expect to come from the conference, and what are the areas of multilateral engagement on oceans this year that you really see moving the ball forward?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the question, Justin. Yes, we are days away. I leave crack of dawn. I'm in London at the moment. I leave crack of dawn for Lisbon. And the conference really gets underway on Monday next week, but there's some special events happening over the weekend, which many of us are involved in. Look, solutions, yes. Member states in their wisdom, because remember, this is a UN ocean conference. It is mandated by 193 countries agreeing at the United Nations that it's time for us to have this conference. And then also remember what it's being held for. It's being held to support the implementation of SDG 14. And Ian Urbina, who's on the panel with me, recently admonished me saying that, you know, SDGs and all these UN acronyms, they're turnoffs for people. But I do want to make the point that SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, along with the Paris Climate Agreement, are humanity's plan for survival on this planet. And whether an acronym sounds boring or not, we've got to support these SDGs. We universally agreed to them back in 2015, and that's the survival plan. And if you've got grandchildren like me, you want people to implement the survival plan. And so stay true to Paris Climate Agreement, stay true to the SDGs, and SDG 14 is what we're gathering in Lisbon for, to assess how we're going, to come up with solutions for where we're falling short. And the SDG 14, of course, is to conserve and sustainably use the ocean's resources.
Great. Well, we'll pick up on a few of those threads in a bit. Justin, I want to come to you next and just ask how oceans fit into the Biden administration's thinking on climate. And then what are some of the key U.S. goals on oceans internationally this year?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, SEJ, for pulling this together, and great to be with you all. Congratulations to Justin on the Climate Environmental Journals of the Year with from Climate Justice, covering climate now. That's great on that one. Justin Kenny with the State Department, and yes, it's a long name, this Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. You can really kind of think of us as the U.S.'s diplomats for nature. And this year, we really have three priorities that are relevant within our Bureau that are relevant to this conversation. One is around illegal fishing and really addressing the climate and environmental security threats that are out there, including nature crimes and wildlife crimes. And that does include IUU, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about. A second goal for us is really kind of tackling the pollution problem, in particular the plastic pollution problem, which is now just everywhere on land and in the oceans and in our waters. A third goal for us is in this 30 by 30 kind of bucket of ideas. This is around what we call people, places, and nature. And it's really based a lot on what the late Thomas Lovejoy viewed around conservation. So those three goals there around illegal fishing, around pollutions with a focus on plastic pollutions in the ocean, and this real kind of global push to protect and conserve at least 30% of our land and oceans by 2030 are some of the things that we're focusing on. So this UN Ocean Conference that Ambassador Thompson spoke to, and thank you, Ambassador, for everything you've been doing for these years to get to this point, and that you are doing. It's going to be really, I think, a really important and historic event for us. So thank you for that. It's coming in the middle of what is arguably really one of the most important years I've seen for oceans, right? And I guess the good news at this midpoint in the year is we are coming in with a lot of momentum. We do have an agreement on developing a treaty for plastic pollutions. We did host an Our Ocean conference that brought together 80 plus nations and NGOs and committed close to $16 billion in actions for oceans. We're seeing really kind of more and more examples of indigenous-led conservation coming to the fore, which is really exciting to see both here in the US and really around the world. And more that we can hopefully get a chance to talk about more. But it's an impressive list of actions, but there is still a lot to do. You know, yesterday was the first day of summer, and this really is and needs to be this summer of ocean action. You know, I like ambition as much as the next person, but it's time to turn that ambition into real actions. And there are many, I could throw out a lot of acronyms that would drive people crazy here, but there are really just a lot of really important moments still to come in this year. And it's really going to be critical that we take advantage of these and keep this momentum going throughout the rest of the year. And hopefully we get a chance to talk more about some of those. Thanks, Justin.
Excellent. Yes, I hope we can dive into at least a few of those actions and some of the negotiations that you referenced earlier. Sarah, I want to turn to you just to provide a little bit of the science background here. You were a coordinating lead author on Working Group 2 of the IPCC's 6th assessment report, and which was all about impacts and adaptation. And I guess I'm just curious, we've talked a bit about the various solutions. Maybe you could give us a sense of where the oceans are with regard to impacts, with regard to the need to adapt. What is the current state of play?
Sure. Thanks, Justin. And thanks, SEJ, for having me on this panel today. The IPCC assessment report really showed that anthropogenic climate change has really driven conditions in ocean and coastal systems that are unprecedented now over millennia. And that has really impacted life in the ocean and along its coasts. And looking ahead, the ocean conditions are projected to continue diverging from what they were in pre-industrial times. But the magnitude of warming, acidification, deoxygenation, sea level rise, all of those depend on the emission scenario that we choose. And so, depending on the emission scenario, the risk of regional losses and global extinctions is going to vary. So some of the examples of impacts we're seeing, in addition to the things I mentioned, are phenomena like marine heat waves. We're seeing more of these. They're lasting weeks to months, and they're exposing species to conditions well outside their tolerance windows. Locally, we've also seen climate change worsening the impacts of non-climate anthropogenic drivers like pollution, like marine coastal development, habitat degradation, nutrient pollution. We're also seeing that risk from sea level rise for coastal ecosystems and people are very likely to increase tenfold well before the end of the century if we don't have adaptation and mitigation action as agreed to by the parties to the Paris Agreement. So really, it's all about the choices that we make now. We're already seeing changes in the biomass of marine animals, the timing of seasonal events, and the geographic ranges of these species. We're also seeing disruptions in the life cycles of marine species and food webs and ecological connectivity throughout the water column. And all these changes really alter the benefits that oceans and marine systems provide to humans, as well as oceans' planetary function overall. I'm sure you've also heard about all of the things we're seeing in coastal zones. We're seeing wildfire and drought and flood reshaping those coastal zones at the same time as we're seeing sea level rise and erosion, severe storms, water quality changes. And we're losing iconic systems like mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, corals. And these systems provide so many benefits to life on Earth. Flood protection, biodiversity, nursery for marine species. And they even can capture carbon dioxide, especially when they're protected from disturbance. But overall, these changes are really altering the supply of life-sustaining benefits to people, things like food, livelihoods, and culture. And that's what we really need to be focused on, is that human and natural nexus.
Great. Well, finally, we'll go to Ian. And so, the rest of the panelists sort of, in introducing them, they have job titles that are kind of self-explanatory, but you're the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. And so I guess I would maybe start by asking you to explain a bit about what the Outlaw Ocean Project is, and then to talk a bit about the gap in coverage of oceans by media and by journalists.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, SEJ. So the Outlaw Ocean Project is quite simply a small nonprofit journalism organization. We are a staff of 10 based in Washington, D.C. Most people are based elsewhere, but we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. And we focus on producing stories, ideally, that are narrative and high impact and often long form. They typically start as written, but they usually have resulting documentary film, in short or longer form as an outcome. And we then publish that journalism in other venues. So we partner with, all the traditional, outlets from the New Yorker to Le Monde Diplomatique, El País, all around the world. And we bring the journalism to those venues for free. And we report in a realm which, Justin, well, and you cover quite well, which is the 2/3 watery part of the planet. So the stories we pursue are all in that broadly defined realm of the offshore space, quite especially on the high seas. And we also try to, whenever possible, which is most of the time, report the stories at least partly at sea, so not on land. So these are the things that we do. And we also have an investigative bent. So that means we are a slow moving beast, and we tend to take quite a while, sometimes a year or two, for one investigation and one series.
Great. Right. And I highly recommend anyone who hasn't checked it out in the audience, check out the Outlaw Ocean Project. So I want to just start a little bit talking a bit about the nexus of climate and oceans. This is in the title of the panel twice. And I want to turn just again for some background and grounding to Sarah. We talked a bit about the problem and the impacts and, your work as an author with the Ipcc. But I guess I would be curious to flip and say, what are the areas in which oceans can be a solution, particularly when it comes to emissions reduction and mitigation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some really important questions. It's the other side of the coin. The ocean is absolutely a part of the climate system. It's part of the engine that makes our planet habitable. And it controls temperature and freshwater availability. And over the ages, it's produced half of the photosynthetic oxygen existing on Earth. And so climate solutions dedicated to cutting greenhouse gas emissions are therefore going to affect the ocean as well. The ocean takes up about 25 to 30% of the fossil fuel released CO2. And so any adjustment in atmospheric CO2 is also going to affect that equilibrium between the atmosphere and the ocean. And that's going to have follow-on effects via ocean acidification and carbon cycling overall. The ocean is absolutely a solution space, though. The high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy did a roundup a little more than a year ago. And they looked at what the global mitigation potential was by each area of ocean-based mitigation solutions. So the top item they outlined was the potential for ocean-based renewable energy. By 2050, they anticipated that it could mitigate 0.7 to 5 gigatons of carbon equivalent per year. And that's by 2050. So that's a pretty big number. That's something we'd really want to run at. Ocean-based transportation. Even though it's easy for us to forget about it, maritime shipping is one of the critical ways that goods flow around the globe. And altering or decarbonizing ocean-based transport is another huge area of ocean-associated mitigation that is already being sort of run hard at and committed to, which is exciting to see. There's also great potential from sustaining and conserving and restoring coastal and marine systems. The science is still a little more uncertain about that because of the natural climate feedbacks that we need to figure out. But that could be number 3 in the sort of mitigation, top 3. And then the high level panel also looked at the potential for shifts in dietary habits around the globe towards more low carbon ways of supplying people with dietary protein, either by increased aquaculture or changing fishery practices, and really moving away from fossil fuel intensive protein sources. And then also an emerging area, which is really an active area of research right now, is the possibility of using the ocean for a partial carbon removal solution. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And then when we're talking about adaptation solutions, the Ipcc report that I worked on showed that ocean-based adaptations really work best when they're in these carefully selected portfolios. There's a lot of different types of adaptation solutions. So there's like management and sort of institutional change. There's technological improvements like early warning systems. And then there's nature-based solutions that we're hearing more and more about, like certain types of area-based protections. And when we develop and deploy these coordinated portfolios of adaptations that address many problems at once, they actually do yield more durable and equitable adaptations overall. So for example, a community might be responding to sea level rise. That solution needs to be informed by the needs of its residents, which might include, needing to access certain ecosystems, needing to protect other elements of the ecosystem, needs to, consider and protect at-risk coastal infrastructure. And each community's responses are not going to be identical to the next, but the ways in which communities develop these adaptive responses should match, in that they should be equitable, they should be inclusive, and they should seek to implement these diverse complementary solutions that have many co-benefits. And we have increasing evidence that that approach really works for adaptation.
Great. Well, let's jump into the intersection between oceans and climate on the international stage. I'm going to go to Ambassador Thompson and then to Justin, just to ask a bit about how you see these discussions, the series of discussions that are happening this year, feeding into COP, but also just more broadly, how they're sort of permeating the international climate policy discussion. Where do you see things going? And we can start with Ambassador Thompson and then go to Justin.
Okay, it's a timely question. I was in Bonn last week at the UNFCCC headquarters for the SUBSTA meeting on the first historic meeting of the Ocean Climate Change Dialogue that was put in place by the COP in Glasgow, the UNFCCC COP in Glasgow. And it's now embedded in the work of UNFCCC. It's now accepted by everybody that the ocean climate nexus is absolutely vital in the true sense of that word, necessary for life. Look, in answer to your question, let me just start with what my thinking is on this. And I have a daily mantra, and I haven't said it yet, so I'm going to say it now, which is that you cannot have a healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and the health of the ocean is measurably in decline. And I won't go into all the indices which measure that decline, but all of them are pretty negative. And for the veracity of that statement, you just have to think about 50% of the oxygen on the planet being produced in the ocean. So you've got to have a healthy ocean if you want us to maintain life on the planet. So where do we go from that? Well, an ocean, it's not me, it's the World Meteorological Organization and Ipcc and all our best scientists are telling us that coral will not survive in the 21st century if we continue on our current track. Our current track is taking us to 2 to 3 degrees global warming before the end of this century. That's the lifetime of our grandchildren. That is a world of famine and fire and plague and war. And that's what we're sending them to when we send them to a 2 to 3 degrees warming world. And that's what we're currently doing, right? So it goes back to what I was saying about being faithful to the Paris Agreement. We're not currently moving fast enough. So I come from Fiji, and every island in Fiji is ringed by coral reefs. And if you know coral reefs, they are just, you know, it's far more fascinating than any other aspect of nature on the planet. You know, there's 25% of the ocean's biodiversity is linked to coral reefs. And we're being told there will be no coral reefs by the end of this century. That's what science is telling us. It's just unbelievable to me that humanity can, you know, coast on the way we are at the moment, like, oh, somebody will sort something out. You know, people are not taking this seriously enough. And for me, coral is that barometer, because once that's gone, how can you have a healthy ocean if there's 25% of the home of your ocean biodiversity has just been taken away from you because of acidification and warming? Take it out of the equation, suddenly, you know, do you have a healthy ocean after that? I don't know is the answer, but it wouldn't look good. And if you haven't got a healthy ocean, as I say, how are you going to have a healthy planet? So anyway, the good news is that, you know, I think we are waking up to the importance of that ocean climate nexus. As I say, the meeting in Bonn at UNFCCC headquarters last week was held. It was very successful. It leads on to a lot of recommendations that will be taken up in Lisbon next week, and from there on to Sharm el-Sheikh in November. And for me, that is about the adaptation side, and that is about committing the money to adaptation, but also to the sustainable blue economy, where the future of humanity lies, both in energy and nutrition and medicines and so on. So sorry to be a bit long-winded, but obviously it's something I feel very strongly about.
No apologies necessary. Thank you. Well, Justin, do you, how do you see, I mean, building off that answer, how do you see oceans coming into international climate discussions? Is it getting the attention that it deserves?
Thanks, and hard to top that answer. It was a great one. But the ambassador is right. Oceans are finally, and I think forever, kind of at the heart of the climate conversations now, which is great to see and important to see. You know, we certainly know the climate crisis is an ocean crisis. And you know, the single most important thing we can do for the health of our ocean is reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible and as fast as possible. But that said, you know, the ocean, not that said, and that remains true. The ocean is also, Sarah has talked about, is a source of solutions. And the high level panel estimates that as much as 20% of the emissions reductions we need to keep that 1 degree target within reach can come from the oceans. This is protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, expanding offshore renewable energy, decarbonizing the shipping sector, which you talked about. And I'll mention, and I can throw into the chat too, just recently at the Major Economies Forum, the US with Norway announced the Green Shipping Challenge, which will be at COP27. And this is to encourage countries, but also ports, companies, others throughout the shipping value chain to really make concrete announcements and commitments that puts the shipping sector on a path to this decade to fully decarbonize by 2050. And that would be an important and challenging goal, but one we really need to focus on.
Great. Reminder just to ask any questions. We've got several good ones, but please continue to put in questions. I'm going to get to the audience questions in just a minute. Ian, I want to turn to you. You know, how do you tell stories about the ocean climate nexus in a way that weaves in narrative that helps people understand what's happening? I think it's oftentimes a challenge for journalists who might feel like oceans are distant. Could you just speak to that a little bit? And, you know, I'm reminded of what Ambassador Thompson said in the beginning about the SDGs. You know, how do you break past some of this this language? You're muted also.
Someone had to make that mistake. So I guess I would start perhaps by just taking one step to a higher altitude. And if you think of the broader problem or concern that exists vis-a-vis the ocean space, and whether it's climate or other things, I think there's just sort of a woeful lack of governance, a woeful lack of attention and concern in a broad way. Then I think if you come down in altitude, you think of, well, how can we change that? And who are the different categories of stakeholders who might be able to affect change? And I think governments are a key category, government to government agreements, government negotiations, etc., treaties, very important, but not the only. And I think, like, at least in my experience, there are other very different types of players that are out there, whether they're fishing companies or global grocery chains or individual buyers or aggregate buyers, like the EU and its purchase, or the US and its aggregate purchase of things. These are all different kinds of stakeholders who have the ability to change the name of the game on the oceans. So while I think all these treaties and in these meetings are utterly essential, and I never mean to minimize them, I also think it's very dangerous for us to get too siloed into a discussion about the ocean space, quite especially when it comes to the high seas, which are in a weird way the least, they're one of the most challenging realms for governments to effectively manage, because they don't belong to any governance. And there's an unusual lack of enforcement capacity by governments when it comes to this space. So when it comes to actually enforcing any of these regulations, whether it's sea slavery or plastic pollution or IUU or whatever, there are no cops out there. So I guess I would just say, like, it's really important to be careful about getting too fixated on one category of stakeholders. And I also, in my own experience, think the market players, actually the companies, have potentially more capacity to change the problems out there than governments, for lots of reasons I can go into, but I won't here. Which is not to say these are mutually exclusive. I want to be really careful. I'm just saying, like, it's very, very risky to start focusing on just policy and treaties and government to government. Where does journalism, I think, the public, individual people, the hearts and minds fight about concern, about solutions, about actions, whether it's individual buyers, individual donors, individual voters, like, that is a key portion of a change model. And journalism has a huge role to play in trying to affect that portion of the pie, in my outlook. And if you're going to try to really aim at that portion of the pie, then you have to speak a certain way. And this gets closer, Justin, to your question. I think you have to really, really be careful and avoid at all costs using terms that are going to glaze people over. And so you have to engage in a translation project. And that's not to disrespect those who are using refined language very carefully, but it is to engage in the important task of translation so that you can speak to the general audience who don't know SDG or any of these things. And so that's part of our agenda. If we are journalists and we're, in my own view, doing a good job, then we force sources and everyone else to explain things in a way and help them that will go to the audience where they are. And the audience should be the general public, not the specialized public, in my view, in what I do. So how does that work? Well, I think stories more than articles. Again, I was an investigative journalist for 20 years, and all I produced were articles, hard news stories, hard news articles, right? Just the facts. We would discover that this is happening, here's the causes, not narrative. But I actually personally think that narrative, telling a story, is a far more effective way, and not for crass reasons, just for simple psychological reasons, of helping people to understand why they should care, what they should do about it, how people are humans, even the people who are up to no good, they have their own self-interest, and explaining all the key information in a story form is, in my view, a really important goal. If you have the luxury, Justin, of time where you can write a story rather than an article, which often we don't as journalists. But I think that's a really key thing, is to try to figure out how to tell a story. And then also humanizing these things is also the key thing that also really has to happen, both from a psychological transformation point of view, but also from the point of view of the silo issue I have with the environmental movement as one that focuses on marine issues largely, and animals and the space, but often forgets the humans that are out there, the workers, the people that from a food security standpoint rely on those things. And we in the environmental journalism space too often are pushed into the purely environmental story, quite especially in the ocean space, and we lose sight of the integral relation that the human stories have as well, the narrative capacity, the psychological capacity, and also just the sheer accuracy, value of including those human rights, labor, other issues in any climate change discussion. So those are some of the priorities and tactics that I would emphasize.
Absolutely. A great point. Ambassador Thompson, sorry.
I just wanted to respond to what Ian said there, because firstly, for those that don't know, Ian has written some of the most incredible stories about conditions at sea, especially in terms of modern slavery and illegal fishing and so on. So congratulations, Ian. The work is incredible. I agree with everything you've just said, but it doesn't detract from the fact that policy is what must lead all this. If you think of something like the Montreal Protocol that stopped the ozone layer giving us all skin cancer by now, by banning chlorofluorocarbons, we've got to have those multilateral agreements. The area that you're really very heavily concerned with of human rights at sea, there's the South Africa, the Cape Town Agreement. We just have to make sure that countries ratify it. For illegal fishing, we've got the Port States Measures Agreement from FAO. We just have to get that stuff implemented and be faithful to it, as I say. So I don't agree when people say there's nothing out there in the high seas. It's a complete cowboy zone. I don't agree with that, because we've got things like the RFMO, we've got the International Whaling Commission, there are things out there that we have, the IMO, anti-dumping, etc. But there's no doubt we need to improve, and that's where this high seas treaty, the so-called BB&J, is going to be so important to us all, and that hopefully we'll get to that later this year in terms of concluding it.
Justin, can I throw one thing in on that?
Sure.
I promise.
Sure.
So again, and Peter and I go way back. So this is two friends debating over something here. I personally think that while treaties and the RFMOs and all of these measures are important, the fact of the matter is most of them are not enforced. And as good as they look on paper, if you look at the range of problems that play out at sea, it's not for lack of rules, it's for lack of enforcement of the rules. And that's often A, because of the jurisdictional complexity of the high seas, B, because they were written in a way that was watered down by key stakeholders with the very intention of them being unenforceable, and C, for lots of other reasons. But I would just say that I think treaties and these policies are really important, but they can also give the sense that things are being done when in fact, the enforcement gaps in all of them, and RFMOs are a perfect example, the enforcement gaps of them and the toothlessness of many of them in how they're written makes them worse than if nothing was there. Because then everyone, all the policymakers and the diplomats and everyone goes home and they think we've done our job, but then the problems just accelerate because there's even less journalistic and other type of advocacy attention on those various issues playing out. We have a treaty for that. 188 and all these issues, if you actually look at how they're implemented and how many cases of these treaties when it comes to sea slavery or IUU or other things are actually enforced in a way that changes lives, I would struggle to be convinced that they work too well.
I agree with you, and that's why in Lisbon we've got to give teeth to the toothless.
I'd love to follow up, Ambassador Thompson, with a couple questions and give others a chance to chime in, and then we just very quickly though, so we can get to these audience questions. But I want to follow up with two things. One is on the High Seas Treaty, and just give you an opportunity to say, where you see that conversation going, where is it now, and why is this important? And the other thing is just to follow up on Ian's question, about the potential for non-state actors, for market, for companies to play a role in changing things, and ask you how much of that is a focus of yours, Ambassador. I know this has been a focus of the UN Secretary General on climate more broadly, but do you see that as a really rich and important area of engagement as well? So I know I'm asking a lot, but those two questions.
Look, this High Seas Treaty has been under negotiation for a while. It's a member state issue. It's not something that you or I, or not wanting to run down journalists, but you can write nice stories about, but at the end of the day, it's the member states. And that's why, and I'm sure somebody's going to ask a question about deep sea mining. I always say, when it comes to these treaties or decisions about deep sea mining, it's your governments. You have to talk to your governments. Journalists have to influence their governments because that's who's making the decisions. And that's the deep sea minerals is an example of where policy does matter, because under law, UNCLOS gives the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica the power over the area, which is the area outside our EEZs, when it comes to the seafloor. So they make the policy, and therefore they give out the licenses for exploitation once the regulations for those licenses have been arrived at. They haven't been yet. So this is my point. If you want to influence what's going on at the High Seas Treaty negotiations or deep sea mining or any of the other treaties under negotiation, you've got to speak to your governments. You've got to speak to your local politicians. You've got to write stories which are going to influence them. Because I know lots of cabinets around the world where the environment minister is a jolly good chap who's trying to do the right thing, but he's up against the minister of economy and a few other guys who are just interested about making money. So anyway, just there's a long-winded way of saying, look, the High Seas Treaty is really important, but it's a matter which member states are going to agree to at the United Nations, and we can be around the periphery trying to help them do the right things. But there are about 5 issues there that remain to be resolved, and I'm sure there will be later this year.
Excellent. Okay. Anyone else want to chime in? If not, we'll jump into some of these audience questions. Okay. Well, there are a lot of specific questions and several more broad ones as well. I think maybe just to start with a broad one, there are 2 questions about storytelling. One which is about, how do you tell stories without disempowering people, and another just about the importance of solutions journalism. And I wonder, Ian, if you might take a stab at that.
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief because I took up a lot of time before. So I'm an investigative journalist. So that's a certain category of journalism. And in that category, at least as I understand it and define it for my own organization, you're looking for things that are broken. And you're looking for things that need a lot of intense light on them. So by definition, you're already hunting for problems. That's a methodological thing baked into the very little section that I'm in. Solutions journalism and being mindful of, kind of undermining public morale is important. It's not what I do. I stopped just shy of solutions offering because going a little bit too far in that direction starts turning you into an advocate. And so where I draw the line, at least for my staff and myself, is I talk to smart people, many of them on this call, and I say, look, you're the expert in this realm or that realm. What do you think is the solution? I then pull them all together and I try to, when I can, render, here's what smart people have told me that they think the solution is, and I'll weight them based on my pressure testing and rigor testing of them. Do they have a self-interest? Do they sustain cross-examination? Do I find them convincing? I'll weight them, but I try to put it out there to some degree. But the bulk of what I do is really focused, and what investigative journalists do is really focus on problems and tell them narratively. I personally think you can avoid, one step back, I think morale is an important concern. But I personally, when I look around the world and I look at places all over the world, the bigger concern I have is a lack of coverage of horrific things happening, not too much coverage that's going to bum out readers. That's just how I view the world and this space in particular. So I'm not super worried about, kind of making people feel disappointed. I do want to write the stories in a fashion that points them in directions where they can get more information of what could be done, policy or buying habits or what have you. But I'm never hesitant about tackling stories in this space because they're more than all of us can get at, and they're not getting covered.
Great. Okay. Justin, I'm going to throw a couple, there's several questions in here for you, and I'm just going to throw a couple of them at you. And one is about Indigenous tribes and, how, well, the question is, does the administration want to bring Indigenous tribes as co-equal participants in ocean management? And do the laws support that? So I'll ask you that one, and then one more, which is about ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention. How is the administration thinking about that? And we'll leave it at those two for now.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Actually, I'm going to follow up on Ian's comments with on the Indigenous-led conservation. At our ocean conference, that was one of the themes that really kind of stood out. And when you look, certainly in the U.S., at where is the leadership coming in terms of additional ocean protections, much of it is coming from Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities. This is happening in Alaska and Hawaii. It's happening on the East Coast and the West Coast, out in the Northern Marianas. There's a lot of really good work being done and really good stories to be told, frankly, about the people and then the communities that are behind this conservation. And it's similar even to what we're seeing on some of the land conservation stories in the moment. So I think there's some really important things happening out there, and really some really interesting stories and interesting people that are behind these conservation efforts on Indigenous-led conservation here in the U.S. and really around the world. And it's something we need to be thinking about and talking about more, frankly, on that. On the Law of the Sea, I'm not aware of any efforts currently underway in terms of ratification for Law of the Sea, but just to follow up on Ambassador Thompson's point, that those negotiations in August around the high seas treaties and such are very important. I mentioned the 30 by 30 work. That's one piece of it. The idea that you would have a framework within which you can create marine protected areas on the high seas. That's going to be important to getting to that goal of protecting at least 30%, protecting or conserving at least 30% of the ocean by 2030. So that's definitely, those negotiations in August are a key moment on the calendar when we need to see some progress made. When I talked about that kind of the Summer of Ocean Action, that's another one for sure coming up. There are others coming up. Well, I would fall into acronym speak if I started to go there, but there are some other really important ones coming up as well.
That's great. I think maybe, just to follow up, because we've touched on it, I don't know that we actually really got a comprehensive sense of what the High Seas Treaty would include or might include. And so I just wonder if Justin or Ambassador Thompson or Sarah, really any of you, Sarah, actually, would you take that one since we haven't been to you in a while? And
I actually don't think I'm the best person on the panel to answer that question.
Well,
I do think that Justin or Peter would be better than me.
Well, okay. Well, we'll go to either of you if one of you doesn't mind taking that.
I will defer to the ambassador.
Okay, well, I already kind of passed the buck to the member states of the world, but I'll say what I guess is on their plate. Main thing is enhanced cooperation. The history of the high seas, goes back to the days of cannon shot and how far your cannonballs would fly. And the Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum. They figured, if you're a great power, the ocean belongs to you. And remember the time when the Pope divided the ocean between the Spanish and the Portuguese, said you take everything on the right. And, Anyway, my point being that right up until recently, it was usually one or two countries that kind of controlled the high seas because they had the biggest navies. But then along came the law of the sea, and it became the common heritage of mankind. Now we've got to, as somebody said in the chat question here, how do we give teeth to the toothless? Well, I've heard Mr. Kerry on many occasions say that we all need to use our navies to do the right thing at sea, and we have been. Look, we've got piracy under control off Somalia in the high seas. There's no reason in my mind why we can't do that for illegal fishing or slavery at sea and that sort of thing. But that's for negotiation at the High Seas Treaty in New York. There's also a question of, genetic resources, marine genetic resources. Who do they really belong to? Is it the discoverers, or is it the countries in which these genetic resources exist? And how we're going to manage all that, that has to be agreed to. Talk about setting up some sort of secretariat for it all. And then again, in the vein of the ocean belonging to all of us, there's this question of transfer of technology and greater cooperation, particularly North and South, developing countries like my own. We're out there in the middle of the Pacific. We can be of great help to humanity in terms of finding new forms of life and all the rest. But we need that technology transfer. And again, teeth to the toothless, somebody asking about that. Partnerships is one of the big things we're looking for next week in Lisbon. And that's a good example, marine genetic resources. There's lots of small island developing states that would love to get into partnerships with some of the big academic institutions that are so well funded up in the north. So that would be another one. Marine protected areas, getting marine protected areas into the high seas. That's another one which is very much on the table for the High Seas Treaty. And again, that is proceeding with or without the rest of the international community. Just have a look at what Colombia and Panama and Costa Rica and Ecuador have done in the Eastern Pacific. Fantastic stuff they're doing, setting up marine protected areas that cut into the high seas. So those would be the main things. Environmental impact assessments would be the other one that they're working into it. But these are all issues which member states are coming very close to resolving this year.
Great, thank you. To summarize a little bit, there's quite a lot is basically the long and short of it that might be included. So it's worth keeping an eye out as a journalist for what happens there. There's a question here about cases where conservation is more effective than restoration, i.e. mangroves and seagrass meadows, or do these need to be done in tandem? And this is for Sarah. And I might also direct one other question to Sarah from which is for all the panelists, but it's really, what are the most urgent stories to be told with so many different climate and ocean nexus stories? What are the most urgent, and are there stories that you think are getting perhaps a lot of attention but aren't actually the most pressing?
Great questions. I think the conservation restoration nexus is a tough one. There's not a simple answer for that. I think there's actually surprisingly little evidence on how well conservation or restoration aims have been achieved. So there's very little sort of like look back in terms of like, hey, this project was established on this date with these clear-cut achievable goals. Let's look back and see how we did. There's not a lot of evidence about that. In a lot of cases, restoration and conservation activities did not have clear-cut goals at the beginning. And so evaluating their success over time is quite challenging. I think another thing that I want to just throw out there to keep this answer short and simple is that we also need to be doing a better job of making conservation and restoration goals climate ready. So it's one thing to say, hey, let's go ahead and put this area-based conservation measure in place in this spot. It's such a cool environment. We have to save it. It's also in a great place politically. Great idea. What that approach ignores is how will that space do over time? So much about climate change is about recognizing there's that fourth dimension of time, change over time. And so any area-based measure you might put in place today needs to be robust for the future, or it needs to be, future change needs to be anticipated for that one. So I know that's not the great answer. We could probably talk all afternoon on that topic, which is why I just wanted to hit those 2 points. And then the question about, what stories are not being told or which things are being undercovered. I really think that I think you probably touched on this while I was struggling with my connection. Place-based stories really resonate with with audiences. There's so much place-based opportunity to spark interest, focus on ingenuity, achievement of common goals, like gee whiz developments, unexpected wins. Those are all the hopeful stories. Those are the antidotes for the stories about ocean impacts, which are, kind of layered and cascading and just, really adding to people's finite capacity for worry. So I think the place-based stories help people find their way into the ocean climate topic, because the ocean can seem too big. It's somebody else's jurisdiction. Surely dilution will take care of all this waste that's going into the ocean. But I think those place-based stories are so critical to help people see their community's connection and their personal connection and impacts to the ocean. And that's not a new thought, but it really bears repeating. And I think, we spend a lot of time as a society looking for cool gee whiz solutions. The latest device to save the ocean in some way or another is always a headline maker. What that can do is that can actually undercut the long-term hard work on systems progress that all of these problems really require. You can't just go and scoop up waste out of the ocean and say problem solved, because there's more waste going in every day. So I think we really need to increase our appetite and our muscles for telling and hearing these complex stories about systems and how systems interact with other systems, because that's what climate change is about, and that's what the solutions are going to be about as well.
Excellent note. We have just 2 minutes, and I just want to ask the 4 panelists a question in that same vein for a 30-second or less answer, which is what is something that you'd like to see more of in climate and ocean stories, very quickly.
So I can go fast. I'll do 3 quick ones. I think the Indigenous-led conservation stories are great, and I'd love to see more attention to those. Plastic, I think we've covered kind of the problem of plastic, really, but getting into what do we do about it, and what do those solutions look like. And the third we haven't talked a lot about is the Arctic, and just the issues that are really unfolding up there that are concerning and alarming. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, I'll jump in from what Justin just said there, because I've just come back from Svalbard. Somebody wise once wrote, if you want to observe change, go to the edges. And, I would encourage journalists to go to the edges, whether it's out in the middle of the high seas like Ian has done, or the edges of, let's say, good governance, or whether it's the edges of things like the Arctic Circle. Now, Svalbard, where I went, is well up in the Arctic. But I went up there to observe the glacier retreats, which are just astounding to see, the speed at which they're just flowing into fresh water into that one ocean that we've got. But what I took away that was most alarming, and I'd love to see a journalist write about this, is that the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem up there is no longer an Arctic marine ecosystem. It's a North Atlantic one. That's, the fish are catching, etc. So to all journalists listening, go out to the edges and observe the changes, and you'll see the truth of what science is telling us about the crisis we're facing.
Excellent, thank you. Ian, last word, and quickly, we're at time.
One is MPAs, marine protected areas. A lot of hoopla about them when they're created, really important. Everyone looks away and they get rolled back, and they're loopholes, and no one covers those stories, and they're getting rolled back right now all over the place. Really good story. Fish meal, huge amount of biomass pulled out of the water, not for human consumption, but for aquaculture and livestock. Also sort of tough story to tell, but really important. Indigenous folks are not monoliths. They're lobbyists for commerce. They're local fishermen. They're folks that claim to represent local fishermen, and not romanticizing indigenous cultures as a block, but instead really digging into which sector of the indigenous culture and which interests. And last one, illegal fishing is really important, but legal unsustainable fishing, RFMOs, giving licenses to completely impossible schemes, those are my 4 top.
Well, excellent. We could have done a whole panel on the last question. I appreciate all the time, Dr. Sarah Cooley, Justin Kinney, Ambassador Peter Thompson and Ian Urbina, thank you for being here, and thanks to SEJ for hosting this, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you to all of our incredible panelists and moderator for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to the Hewlett Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Packard Foundation, and Walton Family Foundation for their support of this series. Check out the recording and chat log on sej.org. Keep your eyes open for an SE Journal tip sheet based on this webinar, and follow SEJ for invites for the next 3 webinars in this series on methane, biodiversity, and business solutions. Thanks again for joining us, and many, many thanks again to our speakers, and see you next time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks, everybody.